Well, welcome. This presentation today is about Lego anatomy. So we might see what's underneath that leaf very quickly here. That's actually not quite true. This is actually about the anatomy of our Lego parts. Having a conversation around the actual geometries of the connections within the Lego system, what those things are called, because it's actually more inconsistent than you would like it to be. And really just building a better, becoming better builders by better understanding how Lego works. Very briefly about me and my own Lego journey. My first big thing I did as a Lego builder was actually my book, The Lego Architect, now 6 years ago. From there, I built a website as well that complements my exploration of Lego, and Lego Storage Guide is basically an ebook that I've produced. And most recently, the mock that's been taking the most attention is this now 3-year-old Henry. They are not free. And this is him building with anything he can get. In this case, some vintage like wooden bricks with snaps on them that were just super cool. And he's got plenty of Duplo too, don't worry. So the genesis for this talk is that I've been producing these Lego brick labels that I know many people use for 6 years now, and the little name on each part is a real hassle. And the reason is that we don't have a consistent vocabulary for talking about parts or connections as a community. Likewise, the actual need to categorize the Lego pieces into nice and orderly groups so you can just find the label you're looking for is really challenging as well. You can organize by size, you could organize by connection type, or you can kind of organize by function, which is what I've tried to do to the best of my ability. Or you can do what BrickLink does and basically make every single part that matters be a plate, modified. It's such a good descriptive organizational system. And that's one of the reasons why people don't tend to organize their own collection that way. So we're gonna nerd out together, and we're gonna start by inventing together our own Lego measurement system, Lego units. So I'm not the first to come up with this, please don't think I'm saying as such, but I wanted to have a really quick and easy way to talk about the dimensions of specific features within a Lego brick. And the easiest way to kind of come up with that is to really lean into what we as builders are pretty familiar with, which is the brick and the plate. And a brick has this 5:6 ratio, which you kind of just have to build into your psyche to build well, especially if you start working in snot. And then there's the 3 plates height for every brick. So that sounds kind of like a number system I could use. So let's actually call those Lego units. So a brick is 6 Lego units tall, it's 5 Lego units wide, the plate is 2 Lego units tall, the stud is actually almost exactly 3 Lego units in width. And the stud, if you exclude the little words on the top, is 1 Lego unit tall. So you got to ask the question, why are we using these units when there's lots of other units in the world, like, for example, the metric system? The reason to not use the metric system is that while the width of a Lego brick is this fairly easy to work with 8 millimeters, the height is 9.6, and I just don't want to be thinking in decimals constantly when I'm trying to think about how to sort of hash out something I'm building with Lego. So that just doesn't work super well for me. And then the other system you will eventually hear about, if you haven't already, is what's called L-draw units. And this is the unit system used to design those little parts in the L-draw system, or many of the apps where you build models digitally also use these L-draw units. And they're exactly 4 times the size of these Lego units that we're going to be talking with. The nice thing about that extra 4x multiplier is you really don't ever end up with things that are fractional in L-draw units, whereas we will encounter a few places where using these Lego units end up with something being a half unit. but we'll talk about that as we go. So here's some example measurements just to sort of lock it in your brain as we're talking. So this first one is the little way in which what is it called, like a plume would attach to the little tiny hole on the top of a minifig's head. That also is the exact same diameter as the stem that flowers connect to. That connection is super interesting and actually more common than you might realize, and we'll talk about it a little bit. At 2 Lego units, you have the bar element that a minifigure can grab a hold of, which also happens to be 2 units is the thickness of a plate or tile, which is why a minifig can grab a tile and hold that newspaper. 3, again, is the width of a stud. About 4, it's not quite right, is a toe ball connection, just to give you sort of a framework as to what that would be. And 5 is the width, and 6 is the height. So we're going to organize the talk a little bit around Lego's 3 systems of play. Of course, the first system of play is called system, so it's hard to talk about the system called system, but that's the one we're all really familiar with, which is bricks and with studs and tubes. Duplo is also interesting because it is pretty interoperable with Lego bricks, and some builders really do use them as the understructure for their builds, or maybe even make a giant ball machine, as we saw over there, using a mix of Duplo and Lego. And Technic is the most modern system, and it does have some quirks as compared to the other systems, and especially which come out in the math. So with system, that is probably the most iconic way in which you can connect 2 Lego pieces. You've got the studs on the top, the tubes on the bottom. The stud is 3 Lego units wide. The anti-stud, which is one of the ways we can talk about the spot that the stud goes in, is also 3 Lego units wide. Now, they're not actually quite that. The stud is ever so slightly larger, and the anti-stud is ever so slightly smaller, and that is what is required to create clutch power. And the amount smaller it is about 0.1 millimeter, which seems ridiculously small, but it's just enough to allow that clutch power we need. And you'll also notice because of that a Lego brick, if you actually measure it with digital calipers, is about 0.1 millimeters to 0.2 millimeters smaller than the units that it should be in the system. And that's actually to allow the wall of the brick to just bow out just a little bit when you put a stud under it. So on the left, you see a 2x4 brick. There's the 8 anti-studs on the underside that kind of line up perfectly with the studs above them, as well as the 3 holes, which are the insides of those tubes. And that's showing just the sort of simplicity and also brilliance of the Lego system, is that you actually have extra connection points just by its very design. And we want to talk about the vocabulary, because what do we call all of these things? Well, the outer edge of a Lego brick doesn't come up very often in the naming, but everybody I've ever talked to really calls that the wall of a brick. So that kind of holds up as a name. And of course, the tube is well known as being a tube. I'm not expecting anyone to wrap their head around this math in real time during a presentation format, but basically the point of this is that because the outer diameter of the tube is dictated by exactly the amount of space needed to create the correct size anti-stud on the bottom, you have sort of weird geometries there. The outer diameter is 4.08 Lego units, which is kind of a weird number in an otherwise predictable system. And the wall thickness is 0.54 Lego units. So another thing you might notice if you actually look at the underside of your bricks is that the wall is not always this perfect 1 Lego unit thick. On modern 2x4 bricks, to save plastic and possibly to actually increase their control over tolerances, they have thinned out the wall a little bit. And then they introduced these ribs. And the ribs give them the ability to make sure that the stud, when it's connected to the underside of the brick, have very precise points of contact, and they can control the friction better that way. And those are called ribs, is the best term I've seen for them, but it doesn't come up very often because most of the part naming doesn't even really admit that these ribs exist. And if you look in LDRAW, the actual 3D models of all the pieces don't actually include ribs for the most part. So this is one of those details that's present in the physical brick, but kind of ignored in the digital realm. You might also notice at the top and bottom, there's actually these cross supports. By starting to thin out the Lego brick, you end up in a situation where the walls might bow outward if you attach a bunch of studs under it. To counter that pressure, they've introduced these ribs that aren't quite the full depth of the brick, but they do keep it from bowing outward. It kind of holds it back. This is one that's got terrible naming. And if you look at the underside of like a 1x2 brick or a 1x4 plate, you'll notice there are these like basically dots in between each of the anti-studs. If you look just at this part on the right, which is the 3065, the 1x2 brick without that thingy, you'll see that they're saying without pin, without bottom tube, without center stud. We don't have a great name for that. So I was actually talking to people in LDRAW community trying to figure out what the hell we should call this thing. The best name that I can come up with is a post. Post being a vertical structure commonly used in architecture that's relatively slender, as a way of differentiating it from a tube, which of course is hollow, and this thing is often not hollow. And then another funky thing that started getting introduced in the last couple of years is a completely different way of designing the underside of a Lego part. And instead of using that post or tubes, they've started playing with these sort of stud holders, which are sort of teeth-like edges on the underside. The one cool thing about this, which is most certainly why they've done it, is it creates a full 3 anti-studs on the underside of a brick. And yes, with this design, you can actually attach a stud that's a hollow stud in that middle position. But with this design, you can actually attach any stud in that middle position, and it's kind of cool to think about why they may have made these changes over the years. Kind of continuing, let's talk about some more connections. That's the, I'm actually gonna stop here and actually ask people, what do you call that connection? Like, what are those? Just chime out. Anyone else, anything different? All right, what was that? Post and clip, okay, yes, good. Those are both names that are used within the community, cool. Which is basically me proving that we don't have total consistency here. So I do call it a bar and clip. I'm not saying that's right. It's just what works for me. And the whole system of the bar and clip is this 2 Lego unit diameter. And here's some of those handles, or those names for the pieces. The Lego group has given us this really, really great terminology, calling it a shaft, which feels kind of aggressive as a name. But that's never, I think, used in the community. It's almost always like a bar or something similar to that. So you've got this 2 unit diameter round thing that a clip can grab onto. If that has an open ending, it's like the one in the upper left side, it's usually called a bar or maybe a shaft. But then if it's actually closed on both ends, we have a completely different name for it, which is a handle. It's like, great, let's make this difficult for people. Whereas on the other side, you see like clip is pretty universal, and hand on a minifig is the terminology we tend to use for that. There are other geometries within Lego that have that same 2 Lego unit diameter. The underside of a 1X brick or plate, that post is the same diameter, so a minifig's hand can like grab onto that if you can get it in the right orientation. We also have both hollow and open studs. And those terminologies are different because the hollow stud is the one with the Lego logo, but it's recessed. And you can stick a post in there. And then the open stud is completely open. You can put it all the way through. I wanted to go to this one next because there's a relationship to the previous. But first of all, what is that thing called? Hinge. Okay, yeah, cool. So again, it's also 2 Lego units. Is the hinge piece. And it's got super interesting geometry. You notice the top part has this thin lip. I didn't include it there, but it's about a half a Lego unit tall. And that allows it to rotate around and create a brick-like orientation with the stud pointed up. And almost, you can use it as a snot piece when you turn it the whole 90 degrees down, and it has that full 90-degree range of motion. And that you can actually attach bar elements to the clip on this piece, and the tiny bars that are part of that top piece, you can actually attach regular clips to, although they don't hold very well because it's only got like half of the width to grab onto. And then from a naming perspective, we got the hinge bottom, top, and hinge. This one I know we're not going to have consistency on because there's so much diversity, but shout out some things you think this might be called. Wow. All right, I have too many people that know me, I guess, because click hinge is actually not used by Lego. It's not used by BrickLink. It's not used by L-Draw. All right. Well, that certainly corroborates my story that maybe that's what it should be called. It's a hinge that clicks. Yeah. Okay, cool. But it has that same 2 Lego units connection as all these other pieces we've been talking about, but it's a little bit more subtle because if you actually look at it on the inside, you see that the 2 Lego units part is actually those 2 little nubbins on the 2-fingered side. You can connect a clip there, but it's not nearly as strong as a proper like handle connection. But here's the names. They're just absolute garbage across the board. We've got fork, locking with 2 fingers, locking dual fingers, 2 fingers without groove, 2-finger end, stub, what the hell that means? I have no idea. It's just total chaos. It's just sort of fun to see how inconsistent things can be, and actually to learn that even we have a pretty consistent name for it anyway. But anyway, the geometry is super cool on this part as well. When they're at the sort of flat orientation, the distance between the plates on the left side and the right side is a full stud apart. They've kind of created this sort of square orientation, so the center point that it hinges on is aligned to the top of the brick, essentially. And even that little chiseled corner in the lower left corner, or in the part on the left there, is to account for the parts bending all the way down and whatnot. And then continuing through our journey, we get into some funny little pieces like this. This one's super neat because it actually looks like a pin from the Technic world, but the geometry is almost perfectly reduced. The pin is 2 Lego units tall. You can actually grab that with a clip. The end is a little taller to actually hold it in place. It's not a super common connection. There's only so many pieces that use this connection, but it's a fun one. And then its naming is pretty rough as well. We've got bearing, wheel holder, wheel pin, small pin, total Wild West. So that one's kind of funky. This one, what's this guy called? Turntable. Yay, turntable. This is an older part, and it kind of shows in the geometry. It looks like when you start just overlaying circles and measurements on top of these parts that it would be 2 Lego units, and it would make sense. 2 Lego units is a very common measure in the Lego system. It's not actually 2 Lego units. It's a little too small. If you tried to put a bar into the hole on the base, it won't go through. And then on the right, the top, the pin is, again, enough smaller that it doesn't really function as a 2 Lego unit connection. So you can kind of just barely get a clip to grab onto that tiny pin, but it's an absolute garbage connection. And then, although it doesn't really matter what we call the top and bottom, because this is not a general purpose connection, there aren't like lots of different bases and lots of different tops. By color, sure, yeah. That's a fair point, actually. But we've got that sort of hole in the pin, I guess, is the connection. But it also just kind of doesn't matter as much as some of the others because it's not interoperable. What do people call this thing? Bad wheel? Anything? Nobody? Yeah, okay, we don't know what this thing's called. It might be called a wheel holder. That's kind of the best I can come up with. And the part on the right is often called a trolley wheel, even though it's usually like a skateboard wheel or something like that. This one's got another example of pretty inconsistent naming. But it also introduces us to something that's kind of interesting. If you go onto Bricks and Pieces and start typing in Lego part IDs, the Lego names that come out are fascinating, often terrible. I've got it on good authority. Part of the reason they're terrible is because they are made up by Danish people, often people in Denmark that are not working with the English-speaking part of the company as much, because the mold makers are mostly Danes. And the translation can get really weird, and the naming can get really awkward. But one thing that they've started doing that I think is fascinating is they're putting this symbol, which looks like a circle with a line through it, which is actually a Danish character, before a number. And that number is millimeters, and that is the symbol that's being used to mean diameter. So they're actually telling us some really interesting information about the actual geometry of the parts in the part names now. And that'll come up in a couple slides because things aren't always as consistent as you'd think they'd be. But that's kind of fun to see. So that's how I can get like that 1.9 millimeter measurement and be pretty confident that's actually what it is. And then what do we call this connection? And this is, again, the one that you use to connect something to someone's hair. Anything? Pin? Tiny pin, okay. This one's another one that doesn't have great naming. I tend to avoid trying to call it a pin because it gets a little too confusing with Technic, although it is pretty commonly referred to as such. At least for my choice, I kind of went back to roots, which is the sort of first time this was used, is as the stem that connects flowers to it. But there are a lot of different ways to talk about this piece. And it might be my favorite connection as I really started digging into the Lego system a little bit more, because these tiny holes show up in the weirdest places, like the underside of a 1x2 plate. Many times that post is actually hollow, and the diameter of that hole is exactly right to do this. So it's a kind of a cool connection that's maybe a little bit underutilized. And I can't remember if it was the US or Australia Lego Masters, but one of the models, they took full advantage of the fact that the end of a sausage is this exact diameter, and it's quite cool what they did. So this one's kind of tricky. Names that I see floating around the community are hair connector, flower connector, stem, prong, pin, which was mentioned several times. And it's just really kind of fun. I'm excited to dig in more. I kind of ran out of time when I was working on this, but I want to go find all the parts that have this connector so that we can start thinking about them a little bit more as builders, because whenever someone uses this connection well, it tends to be really a powerful little storytelling moment within a build, because it's often associated with really small parts that just the details come to life. Oh, and there was one other detail I wanted to say, which is the stem is not quite one Lego unit, unfortunately. It's 1.5 millimeters when I measured it out. And that's a little bit too small to connect to that wheel holder we were talking about a moment ago, which is too bad. And again, I think it's probably because the wheel holder is another one of those older parts that they just haven't bothered to snap into the system as well. This connection, what is it? Mixel, toe ball, ball and socket. Okay, cool. I'm gonna call it a toe ball, but it's not, actually I should go back. It's not quite 4 Lego units, which is again one of those bummers of the math. It's a little bit smaller than that. Although I think the Eldron models might make it be exactly 4, which is why the measurements come out this way. There's a couple of cases where they've made some adjustments to make the system work better than it actually does, I guess is the way to talk about it. And then this one has a whole pile of names. Toe ball, ball diameter 5.9, ball joint 8, which I really don't know where that came from. Mixel joint, and then you've got the ball and the socket. But this is a fun connection. I mean, a lot of fun to build with the posability there. And then what's this one called? Anything? Big ball? Ball and socket? Yeah. If the other one is a toe ball, then this is, I guess, a ball. And this one's got super strange dimensions. It's 6.5 Lego units tall, which means that even though it's almost always connected to a brick, which is 6 Lego units tall, it's half a unit taller than that for reasons. The nice thing about this ball compared to the toe ball, which is that it's a bigger connection point and it's a more rigid connection, so you can use it for bigger models. Naming here gets a little bit funny because the terminology used within the part names, but also the practical usage, because this is also called the construction joint or the bionicle joint or the CCBS, which is constructible building system. What is it? Character Creature Building System. Thank you for sitting in the front row. Well, thank you. But there's a ton of names for this part and this connection. Thankfully, ball and ball socket seems to resonate pretty well with most people for this one, though. And I'm going to go fly through a couple other connections really quickly, just because I can't cover them all in the same level of detail. We've got the minifig, their arms. The arm joint in the shoulder, 2.5 Lego units, which is a nice even 4 millimeters. The hand, it connects to the arm with about 1.5 Lego unit connection, which is an odd one that there's relatively few things you can do with as builders, although never underestimate creative building techniques. Snap tube, I didn't really look at this piece very closely until a couple days ago as I was prepping for this. The center tube on the underside of a lot of round pieces now, it has an outer diameter that's exactly the same as the outer diameter of any other tube. The inner diameter is exactly the same as the inner diameter of any tube, but it's got this little lip around the edge. And that lip is just perfectly designed to allow it to snap onto. There's 3 or 4 different bases you can choose from, and that allows you rotation in your models. But it's just a cool part because you have to really think about how did they have it meet all of the original requirements of a tube while adding this additional functionality on top of it. And this is a fairly modern connection, which is why it, I guess, interops a little bit better with the rest of the system than some of the older ones. The tiny hole that allows the window or door to connect. That hole is a little bit too big for a stem to connect into it. So if you stick like a flower stem into it, it'll just slide right through, but it's close to the same. There's the rail and groove. And here's one of those rare examples of a 2.5 Lego unit depth. The groove in that part is half the width of a brick. The train track, and here's one that's 1.5 Lego units wide. The top of the track, that's how wide it is along the top. And then the roller coaster, again, another really quite recent part. It's not a surprise to realize that it kind of is a little bit more in system than some of those older parts. The diameter of the tubular rails on either side is that same 2 Lego units as a bar or flex tube element. So if you can find the way to connect them, you can make them interop as a builder. All right, let's talk about Duplo. Not very much about Duplo, but it's pretty cool. The way that they managed to make Duplo interop with Lego is actually a little more complicated than I had really realized. The Duplo brick is exactly twice as tall as a Lego brick. Kind of interestingly, the Duplo plates, there aren't 3 plates for every Duplo brick, there's actually just 2, which does mean that a Duplo plate is exactly the same height as a Lego brick, which is convenient, of course. And then I've got these anatomical diagrams of the underside of a Duplo brick. There's some fun geometries in here. The first one I wanted to point out is, while the ribs on the underside of a Lego brick are usually quite small, Duplo has always relied on ribs on the underside to create the correct diameter anti-stud spot. Another one that's a little bit funky is the stud is not twice as wide as a Lego stud. It's actually like 5.75 Lego units instead of 6. And that allows, I forget, actually I do remember. It's because it has to be just a tiny bit smaller so that when a Lego brick is going on top of it, you need to have enough space between the two studs for the middle tube of the brick being attached above it to still fit in there. So they either had to make the Duplo studs just a tiny bit smaller to make enough space there, or they would have actually had to put notches on all 4 sides to allow a Lego brick to attach on the top. So there's just so much cool geometry here that is fun when you kind of geek out on it. And then the other thing that's a little weird is the inside of a Duplo tube, the inner diameter of the tube, is not the same diameter as the outer diameter of a Duplo stud, which means that you cannot attach, you can't really do the sort of tricky snot work, or sorry, offset work like a jumper with Duplo, unless it happens to be one of a small number of Duplo parts like that flower, where the tube itself actually has ribs in it. And those ribs make it exactly the right diameter on the inside to match the 5.75 Lego units of a Duplo stud. And then the other trick, which a lot of people are aware of, is in order to make Duplo work with Lego bricks, where a Lego brick is attached below a Duplo brick, the tubes are recessed a little bit. And they're recessed just a little over 1 Lego unit to allow space for a Lego stud and the writing to fit into that sort of recess. And if you see it drawn out like this, you can see very clearly those middle Lego studs are perfectly aligned to get in the way of those Duplo tubes. And it's just a kind of a creative solution to solve that problem. But again, another thing they had to modify to make this work is if you recess the tubes, you reduce the amount of clutch point between the studs and those tubes. So they actually made the stud of a Duplo brick 50% taller, accounting for the fact that it's already double, at 3 Lego units instead of 2 Lego units. So that gives it a little extra height so that it still has good clutch power despite the fact that those tubes were recessed. So I'm really leaning into it. My hats is off to the folks at Lego for figuring out all these little tricks and making Duplo work as well as it does with Lego. Now, I am not a huge Technic builder, but I think it's fascinating. Oh, question. That's fascinating. So I'm going to add for the people online. I did not realize, and it was just raised, the fact that on plates that are 4 wide or bigger, yeah, so 2x4 is like this, but a 4x4 or larger Duplo plate, the tubes actually are the full height apparently. That probably has to do with the fact that if they weren't, nothing would stop the pieces attached in the middle from going too far up. But that's super interesting. Thank you for adding that. So let's talk about Technic for a couple minutes. I don't like to think about Technic as a different system, even though it really is. And the reason I don't like to think about it as a completely different system is modern Lego has evolved. And the full-on system is all about building with bricks, plates, with the stud and tube connection. And modern Technic has evolved to almost use no studded pieces. And they have their own new set of panels, their own new set of decorative pieces. It really has evolved to be its own thing. And in the middle, you'll find that system sets, even sets for relatively young kids, are using more and more Technic pieces to allow for that interactivity, those play features. And that's usually based on this Technic brick, which is part of the original sort of Technic system. But it is a spectrum, and I just want to sort of call that out as builders, in part just to remind you there's no reason to be purist to one or the other. Use whatever you need to do your building. But Technic, in a pure sense, is evolving to be very independent of system. So the main building blocks are these two, and what's the one on the left called? A Technic brick, yeah, and then the one on the right? Beam, okay. Lift arm, yep. Both of those are the most common 2 terms for the one on the right. And And yeah, lift arm or beam. The hole is either a pinhole, a Technic hole, or a diameter 4.9. I wanted to learn about this whole thing because I was getting really weirded out about the holes. I'm like, okay, why is it 0.49? It should be 0.48 if it was an exact multiple of these Lego units. And so I went and looked up some other parts. Well, that one's got a 4.85 diameter. Oh, that one's got a 4.87 diameter. I have literally no idea what is going on here, but there's clearly either inconsistency in their measurements, inconsistency in their manufacturing, and surprisingly, they're not actually obscuring that inconsistency to us at all. They're actually sharing that inconsistency with us in their part names. Thank you, the Lego group. Otherwise, I think pinhole is pretty consistent for this connection type. So looking at the Technic brick versus lift arm a little bit more closely, you see some kind of weird stuff. Mostly, I didn't really realize until I busted out the digital calipers that even though the sort of grid that Technic is built on is this 5 Lego unit grid, so the space between the pins is always going to be the 5 Lego units, the actual thickness of a lift arm is not 5 Lego units, it's a little bit smaller than that. And that does give things a little bit more play, so you can get different angles and stuff like that. I'm sure it saves plastic. But it is kind of funny, I'd always assumed that, and just getting the measurements out, you realize it's actually just a tiny bit smaller. And then another thing that's fun is, what is the difference between the one on the left and the right, other than the fact that one has axles and one has pins on it? Yeah, it's half. What do we call the one on the right? Lift arm versus beam. Half lift arm, I heard. Thin, thank you. Yeah. So those are all different terms used for the one on the right. It's pretty inconsistent as well. I didn't know this, but Lego calls it a lever and calls the other one a beam. That's what they choose to do. Lift arm thin or 0.5 lift arm seem to be the other terminology. So I'm going to stick with the one we all use, which is a thin lift arm. But the kind of fun thing about this is it really points out the difference between the Technic mindset and the system mindset. Because if I look at the actual geometry of these parts, everything in Technic is on a perfect 3-dimensional 5 unit by 5 unit by 5 unit grid. And then the fact that they have a lot of half thickness pieces mean a whole bunch of things can get 2.5 units. So it would be perfectly rational if you were a hardcore Technic builder to invent your own like sort of measurement system just for Technic, and you'd probably say that you have 2 units for each the space between 2 pins, or 1, and then just live with halves being everywhere. Go ahead. We could call them Technic units, and I think if I revise this presentation, I will add a slide about Technic units. So we're going to wrap up the Technic section, which pretty much wraps up the whole presentation. Thing on the left, what's that guy? Friction pin, yeah, pin, friction pin. And on the right? Axle, okay, cool. And we're pretty consistent on this one, except with the Lego group. They want to call it a peg. Okay, who knew? So yeah, we got the connector peg with or without friction. We have cross axles or axles. So naming's not too bad here. There's some fun geometry. They're all accounting for that 3 Lego unit size hole. But the actual pin to stay in place once it's inserted, the sort of lip around the outer edge is 3.25 Lego units, a little bit larger. And they all are a nice even multiple of Lego units in length. And that's our pin and axle. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about, and it's a pretty well known amongst the community, but I just wanted to sort of build on the language we've been talking about to explain why these are not the same thing. And yes, I know that a half pin is not normally yellow, but I stuck to my theme. If you take a half pin, insert it into a Technic brick, you do not get the same thing as a standard 1x1 snot brick. And the reason is because the hole on a Technic brick is just a tiny bit too high. I believe it's 0.1 millimeter too high. And I've heard that that's because they wanted to make sure there's enough clearance underneath the hole so that there's enough clutch between the bottom of the Technic brick and then the next stud that's attaching to it. I think that's kind of a bullshit excuse. I think it's probably they just designed this part a long time ago and they didn't really feel like working it through. Either way, we have this quirk that we have to deal with. And what ends up happening is doing what I did on the left, where there's a little bit of a 0.1 millimeter difference between the height of that plate attached on the front and the top of the Lego brick. That is considered a legal connection because there's no pressure on the top. Whereas if you look on the right, that is an illegal connection because that's putting pressure on the pin because the plate is pushing down on the outward facing piece. And this is talked about a lot, but this is really why. And it all just comes down to this really, really careful measuring of the parts and understanding how they work together. So that's all I've got. Thank you so much for listening to possibly the nerdiest talk I've ever given about Lego. I have a few minutes, I think, for questions, either in the room or online. So the question was, basically, in practical building, you can get away with the thing on the right just fine. And why is the distinction about legal versus not legal? And is that an LDD sort of question or whatnot? We know that's illegal because early in his career, Jamie did a talk about what was legal and not legal within Lego sets. And he clearly called out that that was considered an illegal connection because of the pressure on the pieces. But I don't think anyone in this room really cares what's legal or illegal when we're building cool shit to show in the other building. So it obviously works just fine. But there are cases in sets, and I believe, I don't know if it was Dave who wrote it, but on Brick Nerd, he did an article that talked about some of these building techniques, and he showed some examples in real sets where I think it was the one of the buildings in the New York set where they started using this technique to build some snot work. And because they used it for one part of the model to keep everything lined up the whole way up and down the model, they ended up using the technique here with the Technic hole with the pin in it throughout the whole model, even when it stopped making sense. And that is to keep it legal. So, questions?
Several people online have asked, are these slides going to be available?
They will be available, probably not as slides, but I realize I did a sort of dry run of this with some sort lug people, and these kinds of drawings are really hard to absorb in a presentation format. So I'm going to be translating them into web resources in the coming weeks and months in the hope that people can sort of go back to them as they need them as builders. So. Any other questions?
And then it wasn't a question, but a comment about the lift arm versus beam. And it was Bruno said a lift arm appears to make more sense when there's an axle hole versus a pinhole in terms of the lift force that an axle can provide versus the friction limitation of a friction pin.
Bruno's absolutely right. That makes sense logically. That doesn't necessarily make it ripple through to reality, but yeah. And I know that the Technic section here is a little shorter than the other section. I want to lean into that going forward too, because there's a whole bunch of interesting geometries for like the gearing system and stuff that could be added. Dan? So Dan was just raising the fact that if you go and take a Technic lift arm, especially the longer Technic lift arms, the hole that you normally put a pin in, you can also put Lego studs in to use as a reversal of direction for Lego bricks. But he was just pointing out the fact that that clutch is extremely tight. And I cannot remember if it's a maximum of 1 or a maximum of 2 Lego studs that they allow to be legal within Lego system contiguously into a lift arm, but they don't let you put like a 6 stud plate into a 7 or 8, a long lift arm, because the actual force to get it back off is just crazy strong. Could be useful if you really want a strong connection, but it's not like allowed. I have no idea. I don't know why they're longer. It probably has to do with either saving plastic or creating the correct tensile strengths and the right clutch power. Saving plastic, you think? Yeah. Anything else? Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This is fun. At 9 o'clock in the morning, like really getting out our digital calipers together. It's fun. So nerd on.